is there anything I should eat? Is there anything I shouldn't eat? That I'm able to give them an evidence-based answer. And we can go really deep on the various aspects of an evidence-based approach to giving someone with inflammatory bowel disease dietary advice. But I didn't come into this with any agenda. I was trying to get answers for my patients. And I gradually, from reading papers and looking at meta-analysis and lab studies and intervention studies, I came up with a list of harmful foods that I would tell people to avoid and a list of beneficial foods that I would ask people to consume. And the harmful foods are processed foods, animal protein, animal fat, dairy, emulsifiers, and food additives. And the beneficial foods are whole foods, fruits, vegetables, legumes, walnuts, flax seeds, and whole grains. So a shorthand is whole food, plant-based.
Welcome to the Awake Asia podcast, where each episode I bring you experts on health, fitness, entrepreneurship, and conscious living to share tips and inspiration on how to live a fitter, healthier, more purpose-driven, conscious lifestyle. In this hugely informing episode of the podcast, I'll be talking to Dr. Alan Desmond, an incredible expert on gut and microbiome health. He's a brilliant gastroenterologist that places a huge emphasis on nutrition. In this episode, we'll dive deep into gut health and find out why there is a huge rise in chronic gut issues, what the science shows about how our diet contributes to inflammatory bowel diseases like Crohn's, IBD, and ulcerative colitis. Beyond that, we chat all about the importance of fiber and how we can make simple steps to heal and optimize gut function long term. You might want to listen back on this again because there's lots in today's episode. On to our chat. I was just scrolling through Instagram and looking at a friend of mine posting what used to be my dinner, a roast beef with charred vegetables, with barely any fiber, with tons of oil, and it was like, and that was what I used to have. I used to go to IKEA because the IKEA meatballs were cheap.
Yeah.
And I used to have like 2 plates of the meatballs and double up with like 4 eggs and a little bit of baked beans. And that was my meal. And, I was like, protein. And I look at what he was having. And then I looked at your post. It's just
polar. Well, you could say polar opposites. And I know that your friend is eating dietary patterns that, statistically, he might get away with it, right? But statistically, it's going to reduce his life expectancy and reduce his happy and healthy years.
Yeah.
So it's that message of positivity has got to convince some people,
I hope so. I think that's actually a good topic that I want to really dive into, because I chatted with someone recently and who had a similar kind of nutrition perspective. And his blood work was great. So it didn't really give him any reason for him to shift his perspective to maybe consider a different way of eating. So have you ever had that experience with patients of yours where, they're eating an animal-based diet and their blood work seems okay? And yeah, is there an issue at all? Is that quite short-sighted to just kind of look at the now?
Most of the patients that I meet, all of them, because obviously, Luke, so I'm a clinical gastroenterologist. So unfortunately, usually if someone's sitting opposite me, they've already got a problem. So very much in my social media profile, when I do public speaking, when I speak at public events, I really want people to be aware of the preventative power of a healthy whole food plant-based diet. But when I see people at my clinic, they've already got those almost entirely preventable conditions that, a healthier approach to eating could have helped them to avoid in the first place. So I guess maybe in a way I'm in a privileged position as someone who advocates very heavily for a whole food plant-based diet, because really I'm there to answer my patients' questions, because invariably there's an issue. And usually people want that issue solved. And usually they want to have every weapon at their disposal in order to solve that problem. So if those weapons include medications, surgery, and a healthy diet, they generally will be pretty highly motivated to do all three. But I guess I do take the opportunity really when I see patients, who I've been able to reassure and they don't have a serious underlying problem. I always take the opportunity to have a chat with them about a healthy plant-based approach to eating. So I guess that you do sometimes say to patients, and if it's completely new to them, they may feel a little bit skeptical. And I guess that's why I don't jump right in. I don't meet patients and have a chat with them and go through all their tests and blood work and get the scans and colonoscopies. I don't at any point just drop the China study or how not to die on the desk and say, there you go, that's the answer. I really try and meet people where they are. So usually it's a bit of a journey rather than a very sudden, like I said, I don't just drop the China study on the desk. You need to meet people where they are,
I love it. And I think with that in mind, maybe we could go back a little bit into how you actually specialize in gastroenterology and how you discovered a plant-based diet. It will be interesting to see how your path came to where you are today, because from what I know, you're the few gastroenterologists. It's quite a tongue-twisting word, I must say. Gastroenterologist that prescribes nutrition protocols. And from what I know, not many of practitioners that do the same thing advocate that nutrition protocols. Am I right to say that, firstly?
I think it's changing. I think it's improving. But you're right. I think a lot of just the way medical school works, we don't get taught a lot about the transformative or beneficial effects of certain patterns of eating. And I think the way, even after medical school, to be quite honest, most of our ongoing education, our ongoing medical education, often it takes very much the form of industry-sponsored conferences, which are, and we need them. We need the industry to support those conferences, because if you want to get 1,000 gastroenterologists together to share cutting-edge science and talk to each other and meet each other and network, and those opportunities are incredible. Because I work here in the southwest of England. I trained in Ireland and Dublin and Oxford. So it's really useful for me to sit down with a gastroenterologist from New York or Singapore or wherever and just talk about shared challenges. But really, those conferences are expensive to run. And unfortunately, we need to depend on the pharmaceutical industry largely, as well as the medical technology industry, to fund those things. But by their nature, they're not getting sponsored by Big Broccoli or the organic food industry. Maybe they could be, maybe they should be, but they're not. So generally, talks on the power of healthy lifestyle medicine just don't tend to feature so strongly there. And I think a lot of clinicians as well feel maybe a sense of nihilism about the power of dietary and lifestyle interventions. Just this past weekend, I was on call at the hospital this weekend. I was having a busy weekend. I spent quite a long time in theatre. I had 2 patients who'd come in with hemorrhages from their stomach. So life-threatening gastrointestinal hemorrhage. So we had them to theatre, did an emergency procedure on each patient, and gladly we were able to patch them up, and they were really, really well after the procedure. But the reason both of those people were bleeding was because they were both on powerful blood-thinning drugs. And the reason they were on powerful blood-thinning drugs was because they both had heart disease. They both had coronary vascular disease, and part of the treatment for that is going on a blood thinner to keep the blood pumping through your coronaries to your heart. So about 2 hours later, I'm walking down the corridor, heading back up to the ward, and I bumped into one of my friends who's an interventional cardiologist. So he's having a similar morning, except he's putting stents in and doing coronary angiograms just on the other side of the building, okay? So he's starting people on the drugs that make them bleed, and I'm on the other side of the bleeding, patching up the bleeds, right? So I had a little chat with him, and I just stopped in the corridor, and I just explained to him. I said, I'm a real strong advocate for healthy eating patterns as preventative medicine. I said, what's it like for you in the coronary care unit? Because he sees his patients all the time. And he said, yeah, I believe in it. I absolutely believe in it. And I happen to know he's a fit, healthy guy. He does a little bit of triathlon and that, so he's a health conscious fella. But he just shared with me this huge sense of pessimism that he has, that he doesn't think he can make people change. So I think there's a lack of education, a perception, a difficulty about how do we implement this stuff, and then maybe just a sense of nihilism where clinicians feel that they can't drive change in their patients. And I think, unfortunately, clinicians are underestimating both their own authority, their own knowledge, and how motivated their patients can be.
Right. So going back to your past, before you actually discovered nutritional intervention and lifestyle interventions, were you kind of in that mindset where you felt like you were just patching people up and people were just coming through and you were just overwhelmed, inundated?
Well, I was overwhelmed and inundated, but I graduated from medical school 2001. And I very early on became interested in gastroenterology as a specialty. And one of the reasons I became interested in it was because of the treating patients with these conditions called inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis. So around the time I finished medical school, I was just starting as like the most junior member on the gastroenterology team as we were going through our different rotations. I would see people who looked healthy on the outside, but were really unhealthy on the inside. These conditions predominantly get diagnosed about a median age of 30. So you got young people, young families, university students, who are in their productive years, and now suddenly they're stricken by this condition where their bowels are inflamed, and often they would come into hospital in a very, very unwell state, and perhaps looking at emergency surgery, etc. But at that time, with these new medications called the biologic drugs, these anti-TNF drugs, which could basically switch off the immune response that was happening in the gut, were just around. So we just started prescribing them. So I saw how quickly, with the right knowledge and the right skills and doing the endoscopy and interpreting the lab results and prescribing the right therapy, how very quickly we could get these young people back on track, get them well, get them back to work, get them back to school, and keep them healthy. But of course, as I spent longer in gastroenterology, I realized, and as it became my chosen specialty, I realized that we were great at getting them better in that kind of emergency surgery, trying to avoid emergency surgery. But as time went by, they just weren't doing very well. And the medications actually don't get most people into remission. They can help to make you feel better and they can tamp things down a bit, but they just don't get people into remission. In many cases, they get like maybe less than 1 in 3 people into remission. So the majority of people with those conditions are living with symptoms.
For long-term use of these medications, are there any impacts? Do they actually affect the gut lining? Do they actually kill microbiome?
Well, in a way, these medications do a pretty good job of restoring the gut lining to what resembles health. Okay, so you can get them really back on track. And when people start these medications, their guts are very far away from being healthy. So they can really help to get their gut back on track. But unfortunately, these medications have a list of side effects as long as your arm. So everything from immune suppression, opportunistic infection, increased risk of cancer. For example, you can't give these medications to someone who might have TB or hepatitis or something, because it will be life-threatening, And so these medications have a long, long list of side effects, and many of our patients do get side effects. So really, it'd be nicer not to be on those sorts of medications, like for all gastrointestinal issues. But from the very, very early on in my career, Luke, I would hear patients asking, we would explain to them. So, for example, we've just diagnosed you with Crohn's disease. It's a type of inflammatory bowel disease. There's sections of your gut lining that are red and sore and inflamed. We want you to be on this immune suppressant drug. Here's a list of side effects. There's a 50% chance you're going to need part of your bowel removed in the next 10 years. You are going to need a resection to remove part of your diseased bowel. You may end up with a stoma. The medication can reduce the risk of that. We have no cure for this condition. You're going to have to come and see me at clinic every 3 months. Here's a phone number to ring the nurse if you run into trouble. So this is the kind of conversation that you have with a young person who's just been diagnosed with this condition. And in every single instance, they say, well, is there anything that I should eat? And is there anything that I shouldn't eat? Because patients with gastrointestinal disorders, particularly Crohn's disease, know intuitively that there's got to be something they can do with food. Not just to make them feel better today, but to help their prognosis, reduce the disease burden, reduce their risk of needing all these medications in the future. So I went out there into the medical journals, the same medical journals that tell us about the new surgical techniques and the new medication techniques and the new endoscopy techniques. But I started searching for evidence-based answers. So when the patient says to me, is there anything I should eat? Is there anything I shouldn't eat? That I'm able to give them an evidence-based answer. And we can go really deep on the various aspects of an evidence-based approach to giving someone with inflammatory bowel disease dietary advice. But I didn't come into this with any agenda. I was trying to get answers for my patients. And I gradually, from reading papers and looking at meta-analysis and lab studies and intervention studies, I came up with a list of harmful foods that I would tell people to avoid and a list of beneficial foods that I would ask people to consume. And the harmful foods are processed foods, animal protein, animal fat, dairy, emulsifiers, and food additives. And the beneficial foods are whole foods, fruits, vegetables, legumes, walnuts, flax seeds, and whole grains. So a shorthand is whole food, plant-based. So I was recommending that to patients before I had ever heard of the China study or Dr. Esselstyn or Dean Ornish or any of these studies. But as I read more about the effects that these food choices could have on my patients, it just opened up this whole new world of medical research and evidence-based medical advice and the importance of lifestyle and diet for people with any chronic disease, including the patients that I see with inflammatory bowel disease. And it led me to become a very open and passionate advocate for a whole food plant-based diet.
So I want to go into what you said about the harmful foods. Maybe we'll start with the harmful foods first, like processed and refined foods and emulsifiers. By consuming, when we go to the supermarket, really 20% of the stuff that we should eat is on the aisles and on the end of the aisles, and the rest of the 80% is processed, almost processed and refined, and stuff that we stay away. So maybe you can run us through how consuming these foods affect and what specific constituents in maybe processed and refined foods affect our gut.
So there's a few aspects. Well, first of all, you're right. Processed and refined foods are a predominant source of calories in the Western world, right? In the UK right now, the average person gets the majority of their calories. That's 55% of the calories from ultra-processed foods. So ultra-processed is like Pop-Tarts, Mars bars, chips, sausage rolls, meat pies, so these highly processed foods, these shelf-stable foods that the food industry has been producing since the 1950s and now are responsible for more than half the calories we consume. In the UK right now, 1 in 5 people is getting 80% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. Crazy, right? And that is one important characteristic of the standard Western or standard American diet or the standard Western approach to nutrition. That means the standard Western approach to nutrition is almost like a recipe for poor gut health. And that is why in these kind of industrialized or post-industrial countries where we eat like this, where we eat this sort of food, we have seen over the last 50 years a slow motion epidemic of gastrointestinal disease and disorders. So if we just look at a few aspects of the standard Western diet that are particularly relevant, and why don't we just keep using Crohn's disease as a model, and maybe we can kind of branch out to others to kind of broaden it a little bit as we go on. But if we talk about Crohn's disease in particular, okay, we just talked a little while ago about how nasty it is to have Crohn's disease and the effect it has on your life and quality of life. So that condition affects about 1 in 300 people in the developed world now, or the Western world, and it affects about 1 in 300 people right here in the UK.
Has that statistic actually risen in just
hugely?
So what did it used to be versus what is it right now? I mean,
So
it's 1 in 300 right now, but previously...
It's 1 in 300 right now. So in the 1940s and 50s, this disease was almost unheard of. It was like interesting case reports. I think when the first ever conference on inflammatory bowel diseases was held in the UK, gosh, I'd have to get out my history books now, but I think it was in the 1940s. I think they'd had 300 cases in the whole country to discuss. So it used to be incredibly rare. And as as countries kind of industrialize their food production, the numbers explode. So if we look at, Europe and the US after World War II, these diseases started happening right alongside the obesity, the type 2 diabetes and the heart disease. And then if we look at Japan in the 70s, 80s and 90s, we see the same thing. And then we look at Egypt in the 90s and 2000s, and now they're seeing these diseases emerge. And as they westernize, or, diet and lifestyle, they're getting westernized diseases, including inflammatory bowel disease. So just to talk about the processed foods, okay? So processed foods have basically all the fiber taken out. They got sugars and oils and salt added to them. But they also have these artificial preservatives, emulsifiers, and additives put into them to make them shelf-stable, tasty, and feel nice in your mouth. So you've got chemicals like carrageenan, polysorbate 80, maltodextrin, carboxymethylcellulose. These are all just chemicals, artificial carbohydrates predominantly, that are put into these foods so that they taste good. So what effect does that have on your gut microbiome? Well, I'll just give you one example here, okay? So maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is in almost every processed food. It's estimated that 90% of Americans eat maltodextrin 3 times a day. So it's really, really endemic in our current food system. If you consume maltodextrin, it exerts changes on your gut microbiome. One of the things you see is outgrowth of a bacteria called adherent invasive E. coli. Adherent invasive E. coli is tightly linked to the etiology of Crohn's disease. In patients with Crohn's disease, they have a lot of adherent invasive E. coli. You don't really see it in other people, okay? You don't see it in ulcerative colitis. They seem to have a lot of it. And it's the very early lesion or the very early disease process of Crohn's disease. This adherent invasive E. coli sticks onto the lining of your small bowel, these particular cells called M cells, gets itself transported across the membrane into your blood system, and then triggers an immune response. And it's the immune response of your body against that bacteria and other bacterial entities that is actually driving the damage to your gut. So maltodextrin promotes the growth of that bacteria. It also helps it to stick on. So it helps it to stick onto the cells, possibly by damaging the protective mucus layer. Then there's another artificial additive called polysorbate 80. Okay, so it's in like whipped ice cream and cottage cheese, and it's also in soft white bread that stays soft even when it's gone green. It's like it's always soft. Okay, so polysorbate is an emulsifier. So if you take a piece of human gut from a patient with Crohn's disease, you can see in the lab, you can see the adherent invasive E. coli sticking on there. If you expose it to maltodextrin, you get even more sticking on. If you expose it to polysorbate 80, the numbers of those bacteria crossing into your body increases by 2-fold. So that is processed foods promoting the growth of and facilitating the invasion of a harmful bacteria. So those artificial food products, they mess up our gut. They mess up this otherwise very resilient microorganism environment that is so important to human health. But interestingly, Luke, if you take that same system that I just described, and this study was done in 2010, if you take those sections of human gut that have Crohn's disease, they've been removed from somebody with Crohn's disease, and you can see the E. coli sticking on and invading as you'd expect to see in Crohn's disease. When they expose that same system to dietary concentrations of plant polysaccharides, that's fragments of plant fiber, it reduced the invasion of these harmful bacteria by over 70%, possibly by helping to fortify the mucus layer. And in that experiment, they used broccoli and plantain. So that's a really nice illustration of why having a standard Western diet where we get 55% of our calories from processed foods, which are laced with all of these artificial additives, and we only get 9% or fewer of our calories from these lovely protective plants and all the plant polysaccharides. That's a really nice illustration of just one element in the Crohn's disease story that makes those characteristics of standard Western diet predisposed to the condition. And then you look at the animal protein and the dairy and everything.
Which is what I want to get into right now. I mean, before we actually get to the animal protein and dairy, plant polysaccharides went in. How long did the changes take? Was it like over days? Was it over months?
So that particular laboratory study was just over days.
Wow.
So in that study, of course, they were working in a lab. They had sections of human gut in a medium, essentially fooling them to think they were still, in the human body. So they were basically able to choose immediately what they exposed that gut to. So that was within a day. But we know that changing your diet has very powerful effects on your gut microbiome, even within days. We saw a lovely study out of Harvard a couple of years ago. They took a small group of omnivorous Americans. They put them on a whole food plant-based diet for 4 days, and they very, very carefully looked at their gut microbiome, and they saw really positive changes happening day one. So you're eating those fiber, you're getting those fiber-loving protective bacteria, you're getting increased diversity of bacteria on a plant-based diet, and they put the same people on a carnivore diet. It was just meat, eggs, and dairy exclusively. Similarly, in 4 days, they saw reduced diversity, reductions in the healthy bacteria that love starch and make all of those lovely short-chain fatty acids. And interestingly, in that separate study, which wasn't an inflammatory bowel disease study, within 4 days, they saw an outgrowth of this bacteria, which likes bile. It's called Bilophila wadsworthia. So it's been linked to the onset of inflammatory bowel disease. So just 4 days on a carnivorous diet, they saw all these harmful changes in the gut microbiome, and they saw some bacteria that could possibly be implicated in causing inflammatory bowel disease. So those changes happen really quickly.
Right. So I guess now that we move on to the carnivorous diet, because of course now we've got keto and of course we've got paleo in the CrossFit community, which we'll probably chat about a little bit later. And of course now even the carnivore diet, which is a whole different thing altogether. It's a whole different level of eating meat. So how does animal protein actually affect the gut?
Not well.
In a nutshell.
Not well, in a nutshell. I mean, I've got to say, when I look at a healthy whole food plant-based diet, and I look at the kind of, popularized paleo diet, there's a huge amount of crossover there. There's a lot of commonalities. If you look at a Venn diagram, there's a big overlap. Okay. So those people who like to eat that kind of modern paleo diet don't have any dairy, they don't have any processed foods, and they eat a lot of vegetables, essentially. So I can agree with them on all of those things. I wish they would eat more vegetables. I wish they would have a greater variety of vegetables. As you may well know, the number one determinant of a healthy and functional gut microbiome is the diversity of plants in our diet. So I wish they would consume more. But they also eat a lot of meat. But I guess with those paleo people, I always thought, well, okay, look, they're eating a lot of meat, which is not a good thing. But they're also eating a lot of vegetables. They're not having any processed food, and they're not having any dairy. So that's okay. That's better, But since this whole carnivore thing has taken off, I've just lost all hope. Because what are you eating on a carnivore diet? All you're eating is meat, right? They're just meat. So you're getting calories for sure. I'm sure a lot of people who've been eating a standard Western diet may temporarily feel better on a carnivore only diet because they have taken out all the dairy and the processed crap and the hot dogs and all that kind of stuff. And my understanding is that people on the carnivore diet tend to avoid processed meats as well, I think. But you're eating every day, you've got this really high intake of animal protein, which we know is a predictor of a shorter and sadder life. So you might lose weight, you might look lean on the outside, but on the inside, things are not going well. Because what are you eating? Every day, 3-4 times a day, you're sitting down to a plate of food that is laced with heme iron. This is pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, and increases your risk of bowel cancer. You're cooking meat, you're producing these harmful byproducts, these PAHs, the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the heterocyclic amines. These are pro-inflammatory, pro-oxidative, and carcinogenic. You're boosting your levels of insulin like growth factor 1, which promotes cell growth in your body, which sounds like a good thing. But once you're fully grown, producing, boosting up your IGF-1 levels is also going to promote excess growth, disordered growth, i.e. promote the growth of cancers and tumors. And you're also sitting down 3 times a day to eat a big carnitine-rich meal. So carnitine from meat is converted by your gut microbes into a substance called trimethylamine, TMA, gets absorbed into your body, goes to the liver, your liver turns it into TMAO, which acts directly on your blood vessels to promote atherosclerosis, heart disease, and stroke, and even recently has even been linked to the onset of colorectal cancer. In the UK, 42,000 people a year get colon cancer. 9,000 of those are due to the consumption of red and processed meat. That is mainstream science. We know that high intake of red meat significantly increases one's risk of colon cancer. And that goes for the carnivore people and the paleo people, because you cannot reduce that risk by having some spinach with your 6-ounce steak. Okay, it's an independent predictor. So in terms of gut health, you are on you're on a no-win approach to your nutrition, really. Not to mention Crohn's disease. So we know high intake of animal products is an independent risk factor for Crohn's disease. A study done in France about 10 years ago. They followed several tens of thousands of healthy middle-aged women for about 15 years. And what did they find? They found that high intake of animal protein was an independent risk factor for developing inflammatory bowel disease.
So with that in mind, when does the drop-off or the tipping point actually happen? Because, for example, someone who's on a processed, sad diet moves on to paleo and starts to feel better, or moves on to keto and starts to get better blood work, and starts feeling quite complacent in that sense. It's like, okay, well, my blood work's great. I'm feeling great. I've got more energy. I've got more focus. But when does that tip off actually happen? Because you shared earlier that you're not going to have a long and happy life. So,
well, statistically, like I said, there's going to be people at either end of the bell curve, right? So statistically, you are reducing your risk of having a longer, happier, healthier life, and you're increasing your risk of innumerable diseases. So you might get away with it, but statistically, and that's what we need to do in life, right? We need to play the odds. You need to inform yourself and make healthy choices.
Of course. So with that in mind, I think non-plant-based advocates, while paleo-esque advocates would bring up the Masaai and the Innuits. And the studies of them, particularly the Masaai not having atherosclerosis and not having heart disease. So do you know much about those studies and what they represent?
So I have to say, when I've seen some public advocates for keto and high fat and high protein diet quoting really old papers about the Maasai people, and when I went and dug out those papers, they didn't support what those advocates were saying. They were really kind of cherry picking facts from those papers. Even I watched a talk with Nina Teicholz, who kept showing slides, showing this paper on the healthy Maasai people, which I must say didn't quite match up with my own experience as a medical student. I spent some time working at missionary hospitals in rural West Africa, and then we went traveling around East Africa, and I went and met some Maasai people and visited their dwelling place. And I have to say, I felt bad for them. I felt these are people living on the fringes of society, and they seemed rather malnourished and unwell. So when I saw Nina Teicholz citing these people as the epitome of human health, I went and looked at the papers that she cited. They just didn't support what she was saying. They were talking about.
Maybe you could kind of expand on that. Like, what was she citing, and what did you actually discover?
Well, she was essentially saying we should all eat more like the Maasai. We should take a lot of dairy and take a lot of meat. But these poor Maasai people were expending thousands of calories per day, always on their feet, living a very, very harsh existence. They were generally underweight, not at a healthy body mass index, and had a shorter life expectancy than even people on a standard Western diet. So I don't get why people would hold them forth as kind of an epitome of human health. I must say I'm not too familiar with the Inuit studies, but I understand that there are, particularly some particular genetic anomalies there that may account for why they're able to eat a higher fat diet. But in terms of gut health, I haven't seen any papers about inflammatory bowel disease or gut health among the Inuit. But I would be really concerned that anyone eating a very low fiber diet and a high animal product diet statistically would be very likely to have problems with diverticular disease, Crohn's disease, colitis, and colon cancer. And this goes without saying, Luke, most of the people that I see at my clinic, they're not Inuit or Maasai. They're living in the 21st century right here in, industrialized Europe. And so I think sometimes perhaps looking at those populations isn't entirely applicable.
Yeah, I agree, because at the end of the day, with these populations, they don't really have the choice and variety that we have, and the options to be able to walk into a grocery store and get fresh vegetables, and they're really stuck with what they have around them. And I can't imagine an Inuit having a Buddha bowl in the height of winter. So,
no.
So it's a little bit challenging. So with that in mind, I mean, we talked about Crohn's, and I maybe you could just kind of differentiate what Crohn's is versus, you mentioned briefly, IBD and ulcerative colitis. Are they different grades of gut dysfunction?
They're just two different forms of inflammatory bowel disease. So Crohn's disease is a disease where you get inflammation in patches throughout your bowel. It can be anywhere in your gut, often in the small bowel. And in ulcerative colitis, it's a similar condition, but all the inflammation is limited to the colon. It's really interesting, the importance of the gut microbiome in these conditions. When we look at Crohn's disease, as I said, we generally see it affecting people in the very last part of their small bowel and in their large bowel. And of course, the gut is, although it's filled with bacteria, it's relatively sterile up in the stomach. And then the further you go down and the closer you get to the end of the small bowel, the amount of bacteria, the richness of the microbiome increases and increases. Then there's a huge step up in the terminal ileum and another big step up in the bacteria within the colon. And guess what? That's where we tend to find colitis and Crohn's disease.
Right. So where these conditions are concerned, do genetics contribute to it?
So like most chronic diseases and diseases of the Western world, there certainly is a genetic component. And these diseases are multifactorial, and there are other aspects of health that are important. So, for example, smoking is really important in Crohn's disease. There's been plenty of studies telling us that our patients with Crohn's disease should not smoke. But when I was in medical school, we were told that Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis were just like predominantly genetic problems. There was something wrong with your genes, so your immune system was attacking your gut. We can't do anything about it. Here's some medication to make you better, which I guess is what people say about a lot of medical conditions. But when we actually look at IBD, there was a study done published in 2016 in The Lancet, one of the most detailed genetic analyses ever performed in a chronic disease. They had 30,000 patients with various forms of inflammatory bowel disease from 16 countries across Europe, North America, and Australasia. And they did a full genetic analysis on these people. And they did find that there was genetic markers that would predispose potentially to developing these conditions, about 106 different genetic markers. But having those genetic markers did not automatically mean that you got the condition. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that those genetic markers told the researchers nothing about disease severity. So having the genetic markers that they could identify said nothing about how severe the disease was going to be. Were you going to need surgery? Were you going to need immune suppressing drugs? So in that paper, published in the Lancet, leading medical journal in 2016, even the researchers who spent all those years doing detailed detailed genetic analysis on 30,000 people said the genetic variants studied here have a small effect. The environmental factors, including diet, are more important in determining disease severity. So environmental factors are so much more important than the genetic story. That's not to say genetics aren't there, they are, but it's about, in many ways, the lifestyle we lead and the food that we choose to consume.
So now that, of course, there's also things like gluten, and some people have actually attributed leaky gut to gluten intolerance. So maybe you could expand on what the issue is with gluten. Is there, how many, is that really a big issue, and how does that contribute to leaky gut?
So I guess leaky gut isn't really like a clinical entity. I don't have patients who come to see me at clinic because they have leaky gut. I guess leaky gut is more of a laboratory finding. And we do see leaky gut as a feature of many gastrointestinal disorders. I guess what we're referring to there is the fact our gut lining, which covers about the area of a small tennis court, is what separates us from what's in our gut. So it separates us from the environment that we choose to expose our gut to. And in many parts, it's just like one cell thick. So you got this little layer of cells. They're all stuck together with these little tight junctions. They're covered in a protective layer of mucus that we talked about earlier. So leaky gut refers to a laboratory finding where this protective process has been damaged or eroded. So the mucus layer is reduced, so bacteria and toxins and bacterial byproducts can stick right onto the lining of the gut. And the tight junctions holding the cells together have become less tight in areas, again, allowing undigested food particles, microorganisms, toxins, and bacterial byproducts to actually get across and enter the system. So I think that's what people are referring to when they refer to leaky gut. But that is something that you can see in a whole host of gastrointestinal disorders, including Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and celiac disease. That doesn't automatically mean it has the same etiology. But when I look at, for example, patients with celiac disease, so celiac disease is where your body is generating an immune attack on gliadin, which is a component of gluten, which is found in wheat. Okay? So that doesn't mean that eating wheat is the problem. That may not be what gave you the sensitivity to wheat. So if you can conceptualize that you are healthy, you don't have celiac disease, but maybe you've got some genetic markers that mean your body would be really good at making antibodies against gliadin, and you're on a standard Western diet, and you're eating the emulsifiers and the processed foods and the pro-inflammatory meat products, etc., and you're eating wheat. So then your leaky gut allows some wheat products to get exposed to your immune system, and you develop antibodies. That doesn't mean that wheat itself initially caused the problem. I guess it's just a symptom or a side effect of having a kind of a standard Western diet. That being said, for patients who've been diagnosed with celiac disease, while I always talk to them about taking a healthy plant-based approach to their diet, I also always ask my patients to try and eat a naturally gluten-free diet. So just to remove the wheat products without substituting in these highly processed kind of gluten-free cakes and pastries, etc., because I don't want them eating more processed food. I want them eating more healthy food. So I'm really lucky at my clinic, at Devon Gut Clinic, to have a really awesome team of dietitians who will work with me. So our newly diagnosed patients with celiac disease, we do get them on a gluten-free diet, but we want them to be on a healthy, whole food, naturally gluten-free diet. So as well as eliminating the inflammatory process they get, hopefully we can prevent even more damage happening, and we can reduce the risk of developing other gastrointestinal problems. And you can still eat some whole grains. There are gluten-free whole grains like freekeh that can be consumed on a healthy, plant-based, gluten-free diet. So, I think that's important. There is the other entity of gluten sensitivity, where people have been tested for celiac disease and they don't have celiac disease, but they themselves have learned that if they eat bread, they don't feel well. Usually what we do there is we kind of work with people to find out, well, what are you eating with the bread? What sort of bread are you eating? Is it like white processed bread, or is it like a nice whole grain bread with no additives? And what's the rest of your diet like? And in my experience, most of the patients who come and see me, or, for example, take part in our Happy Gut course, an online course that I run with the Happy Pair and Rosie, an awesome plant-based dietitian. Most of the patients come into that saying, oh, I can't eat bread, I've got gluten sensitivity, so I can't have any whole grains. By the time they come out of 6 or 8 weeks where they've really improved their dietary intakes and maybe moved as far as they can at that point to whole food plant-based or completely to whole food plant-based, they suddenly find out, hey, I'm having whole grain bread and I'm really enjoying it. So it's not often for me, it's not just a gluten issue, it's a whole diet issue.
So if we look at gluten and celiacs, how much of the population actually suffers from gluten sensitivities, and maybe who are celiacs?
Yeah, so the prevalence of celiac disease in Europe, the UK, and the US is thought to be about 0.5 to 1%. So it is really common, actually, much more common than people think. So if you do have symptoms that make you think you might have an issue around wheat and gluten or any GI issues, certainly where I live, as soon as you see the GP, they'll do a blood test to screen for celiac disease because it is so common. But then the issue where people identify that they may have an issue around wheat, so they may have like a non-celiac wheat sensitivity, I've seen papers saying that might be as prevalent as about a third of people. But I must say, when I meet those people, it turns out that in most cases, it isn't a bread issue. It's a kind of a whole dietary approach issue.
So now moving to whole food plant-based, say someone that is listening to this and decides that they want to give this whole food plant-based thing a go, but what I've heard from some people is that because all of that fiber that comes in messes with the gut, whether eating legumes, and I had that issue because I came from a high carnivorous animal protein diet. I came into this whole lifestyle for ethical reasons, so I did it overnight, and I substitute my kilo of meat for a kilo of tofu, 800 grams of
nice
beans. It didn't sit well in my gut. So maybe not everyone's going to do that, but some people that actually want to kind of dip their toes into this and start eating legumes and start feeling, doesn't sit well in my gut. What can they do?
Sure. Well, that's pretty common, isn't it? So when people move from a standard Western diet to a whole food plant-based diet, they're making a lot of changes very quickly. They're increasing their fiber intake from the kind of standard Western intake of 12 or 13 grams a day, which is like a third of the minimum requirement. And they're maybe stepping that up to 45 or 50 grams per day. And after a lifetime of eating a standard Western diet, they're now expecting their gut and their gut microbiome to make those changes overnight. Now, those changes do start day one, but it's not a complete overnight transformation. So a few things. Number one, you might want to take it slow. Rather than doing what you did and just becoming whole food plant-based overnight, you may want to take it slow. You might want to say, okay, I'm going to give it a month. I'm going to do breakfasts. All my breakfasts are going to be plant-based. Then the next week, I'm going to do breakfast and lunch. Then the following week, I'm going to do breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And then by week 4, I'll be on to snacks. So it's going to take me 4 weeks to transition. So that can be really helpful, taking it slowly. The other thing is if you decide to go plant-based, please go whole food plant-based. Don't become a junk food vegan. If you day one go out, you go, okay, I'm going to be vegan. I'm going to go and fill my freezer with vegan pizza and vegan cheese and vegan cheesecakes and vegan donuts. You're going to be possibly making a healthy choice there. You're getting rid of the meat, but really you're filling your body with fats and oils and additives and sweeteners that your body does not need. So that might cause an issue for you. So, maybe do it gradually. Don't be a junk food vegan is a really helpful choice. The other thing I would say is find foods that you already enjoy and maybe just veganize them simply. If you like a nice pasta and chicken dish, maybe just get a nice whole wheat pasta and put in a little bit of lentils and do a nice, a cheese-free pesto sauce. So you choose foods that you already enjoy eating, or get some really awesome plant-based cookbooks and choose meals that look familiar to you and food that you think you would enjoy, but just happen to be done in a nice, healthy, plant-based way. You don't need to eat like your favorite Instagrammer. You don't need to eat like your favorite YouTuber. So just find foods that you enjoy and incorporate them. And the last thing I would say on that is variety. Variety is key. And if you are eating healthy, whole food, plant-based, and you've gotten yourself some nice plant-based cookbooks, and you're using meals that you used to like, and now you're kind of veganizing them, make them healthier, hopefully that will automatically build in a variety of plants into your diet, because variety is key to promoting good gastrointestinal health. So for me, whole food is as important as plant-based, and variety is king.
Variety, whole food, and plant-based. So you mentioned fiber earlier, and I think you briefly said about how moving towards a whole food, plant-based diet, your fiber intake per day could go up to like between 40 to 50 grams, roughly. So for an average paleo person, or I guess we look at a standard American or SAD diet versus a paleo person, what would their average fiber intakes be versus a whole food, plant-based, which is probably sitting up at about 40 to 50 grams?
So on a standard Western diet, we know the answer to this. In the UK, the average male eats about 18 grams of fiber per day. The average female, about 17 grams of fiber per day. In the United States, it's about 13 or 14 grams of fiber per day, with 95% of people failing to get to that kind of minimum requirement of 30 grams per day. 30 grams per day. So I mentioned earlier about plants and fiber and how they protect us from Crohn's disease. We know a lot of that comes from the Harvard nurses study data in the US, where they followed tens of thousands of health professionals and looked at their dietary intakes. And in that study, the participants with the highest intake of dietary fiber had the lowest risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease. They reduced their risk of Crohn's disease significantly. But even in that population, the high fiber participants were still only consuming 27 grams of fiber a day. So they weren't even getting to the minimum. So we know that low fiber intake is almost, it's a given on a standard Western diet. I think when people move to the kind of modern incarnation of the popularized paleo diet, they do make an effort to increase their intake of fruits and vegetables, with some very non-evidence-based exclusions like legumes and potatoes, but they do increase their intake of fruits and vegetables. So I'd imagine their fiber intake improves, and that would be to their benefit. But really, if you want to maximize those benefits, I would say, look, lose the meat, buddy. You're not doing yourself any favors. There probably was a time in human history when people lived in terrible adversity, in a calorie deficit at all times, and basically wanted to get enough calories in so they could get through their day and make it to reproductive age. And I don't really care if those poor people who lived thousands and thousands of years ago were vegan or paleo or plant-based. I assume they just ate whatever the hell they could get their hands on. And if they could get their hands on some meat, which is very high in calories, then that probably gave them a short-term survival advantage. But all the research, all of the studies we see in the Western world, from the blue zones to the data reviewed by the Eat Lancet report, which came out in February, if you look at the dietary guidelines here in the UK or in Australia or in the US, you will see that that sort of high intake of meat, or even eating meat at all, does not give you a survival advantage in the 21st century. It's the opposite. So if you're on a kind of a paleo diet right now, and it's one of your CrossFit buddies who's eating loads of fruits and vegetables and meat, you've got to bring them to the supermarket and walk them around to where the tempeh and tofu and legumes are, and say, yeah, you're feeling pretty good now. Wait till you see what you can do when you start eating this stuff.
100%, 100%. So while we're on fiber, I just want to kind of zip back a little bit, because I know of people who are, well, and I know many people that go into the supermarket or go into the chemist to buy like fiber gel, like to make up for their fiber intake. So what's your take on all these fiber supplements?
Sadly, Luke, I prescribe them. I prescribe them because when I see patients at my clinic, and if I think this person is suffering from constipation or bowel syndrome, diverticular disease, those sorts of conditions that we get on the standard Western fiber depleted diet, I'll ask them, how many pieces of fruit do you eat per day? How many servings of vegetables do you eat per day? How many servings of whole grains do you eat per day? And sometimes that number adds up to one. And that's very common. That's no judgment on people. That's the food culture they've grown up in. And they often don't know what a whole grain is, really. We have to spend a little bit of time chatting about what a whole grain is. So often in those cases, as a kind of a temporary measure, I'll prescribe them maybe 10 or 15 grams of fiber per day in a soluble form, usually, just so they can, and it's really beneficial for patients, actually, because suddenly they realize how impactful having a steady supply of fiber can be. And then I provide online resources for my patients, and if needs be, I'll get them to sit down and spend time with one of the wonderful dietitians that I work with, and it'll just start them on the journey. So my goal really is not to have patients on fiber supplements long term. There is no substitute from getting your fiber from fruit and vegetables and whole grains and beans and seeds and legumes, because they come wrapped up with phytonutrients and vitamins, your vitamin A, your vitamin C, your B, your non-B12 vitamins, your phytonutrients, your antioxidants and all that. You're not going to get that from a tub of viscous goo that you can buy in the supermarket. So I want people to get their fiber from whole foods. You can only get fiber in plants. But temporarily, if you're making a change, then using those things can be really useful. I listened to an interview with Rip Esselstyn just yesterday, and he was talking about his Engine 2 diet and how they did clinical studies on that. And they would ask people entering his kind of 4 to 6 week immersion program of healthy whole food plant-based eating. He would ask people, and this is in the US, what's your number one source of fiber in your diet? And they would all put down things like Metamucil or all these products that they were buying in giant tubs to try and keep their digestion on track.
So go back to the basics. So
go back to food.
Go back to food. So in terms of legumes, I'm not sure whether you're aware of Dr. Gundry's work, The Plant Paradox. Maybe you could.
I am. So
awesome.
So Dr. Stephen Gundry is a very successful author. He's written some #1 best-selling books. He also sells a line of supplements to help protect people from what he describes as a form of chemical warfare on your gut, which is beans, or more specifically, lectins. Okay? So I remember a few months ago, we mentioned earlier Dr. Michelle McMacken, who has a great plant-based program at NYU in New York. And I remember Michelle messaged me after I posted about lectins, and she kind of messaged me and said, oh, if I had 2 cents for every time someone asked me about lectins, I could go on a nice holiday. And I messaged her back and I said, well, Dr. Gundry has $199 for everybody who asked him about lectins, So that's a little bit, that's a little bit unfair on Dr. Gundry. I imagine that when he came into this, he was trying to help his patients, and that he is, that he would view his view on things and the advice he's giving people as healthy advice. But the advice he's giving doesn't seem to be evidence-based, to be honest. Lectins are these substances that, yes, they're found in fruits and vegetables, and they're particularly found in beans. And they can cause inflammation in the gut. And if you consume them, they can give you diarrhea. So rather than spending a bunch of money on medications to help block these harmful lectin effects, there's a much simpler solution, and that is to cook your beans. Because if you cook your food and you cook your beans, you won't get the harmful effects of lectins. So I don't know any culture where people eat a lot of raw beans, and I think that's why. Because eating raw beans will give you digestive issues. Now, in the laboratory, these lectin substances can be shown to bind to the thyroid gland, they can be shown to bind to the pancreas gland, But when you consume them, they just don't get into your bloodstream. So it's sort of taking a laboratory finding and extrapolating it out to a human population. And because lectins have been shown in the laboratory to have certain effects, thereby Dr. Gundry recommends not consuming beans. But this is the sort of backwards logic that we sometimes see, I guess, in popular diet books. It's certainly the kind of backwards logic that I see a lot with people who promote a paleo diet or a high-fat, low-carb diet. So, like any good scientific principle, you need to start with observation. So if I go out in the world and I look at populations who consume a lot of beans, I find populations with lower risks of colon cancer and heart disease and breast cancer and a longer life expectancy. So, Dan Buettner's Blue Zones work is a really good illustration of that. He describes bean consumption as one of the common characteristics of healthy, long-lived populations. Okay, so as a scientist, I would go out and confirm that observation. I would do more studies. I might go to individual countries and look at their bean consumption. If I wanted to know what effect it had on the gut, maybe I would do a study like the National Polyp Study that was done in the US a few years ago, where they looked at a healthy dietary intervention in people with precancerous polyps and found that by increasing your bean consumption by about 1 or 2 servings a day, you could reduce your risk of developing precancerous colon polyps by about 70%. So I'd go out, I'd make those observations, I'd refine those observations, and then maybe I would start examining the contents of beans to find out why they're so beneficial. And I would find out that they've got all the great sources of fiber, and the gut microbiome loves fiber, and then the microbiome components that love fiber become more abundant, and they break down the fiber, and they generate short-chain fatty acids, which reduce systemic inflammation and act as a food source for the colonic cells that line the gut. That 70% of their energy comes from short-chain fatty acids, which is made from beans by your gut microbiome. I would find out that those short-chain fatty acids also interact with the lining of the gut to help reduce one's appetite and help to regulate one's blood sugars. And that would be giving me a lot of, okay, so that's why all those populations who eat beans are so healthy. But what some scientists do is they look at a laboratory finding and they go, ooh, beans can, in the lab, I can get beans to bind onto a pancreas cell. Beans must be causing diabetes. Nobody eat beans. So they skip the observation bit and they take a lab finding and turn that into a really bad recommendation. So please, I bought one of Dr. Gundry's books. It was tough to read, not because it was badly written. I mean, it's very, it's a nicely written book or whatever. But when he cited a study as showing something, and then you would go and look up that study, it just didn't show what he was saying. So I'm sure Dr. Gundry is out to help people and is trying to improve people's health. But I would not buy his book.
Well, yeah. Looking at it from a very macro, we need to look at observational studies. We need to look at epidemiological studies. We need to look at clinical trials. And I think that's the beauty about a plant-based diet, isn't it? Because it looks at the whole perspective from different angles.
You've got to look at the whole picture. And I mean, I mentioned Dan Buettner's work, which he started about 16 or 17 years ago, when he went out to look for the longest lived and healthiest populations in the world. And he described the blue zones. So you're very familiar with this. If no one has heard of the blue zones, they need to go and look it up. It's fascinating. And he looked at these populations around the world who had the healthiest and most long-lived life expectancy. And he found that they were eating like 98% plant-based. And they were eating hardly any meat at all. And when I look at the dietary patterns that those people had, I'm like, well, that's how I want my patients with diverticular disease in the southwest of England to eat. And then when I look at the Eat Lancet recommendations, which were published just this February, where the Eat Foundation combined with the Lancet Medical Journal and got about 40 experts on human health and planetary health to review all of the evidence and come up with a kind of a blueprint for how to feed a healthy population on a healthy planet. And they wanted a healthy dietary blueprint for our future population of 10 billion people. They wanted a dietary blueprint that would work for right now we've got like 3 billion people in the world who are suffering from obesity and all the problems that brings. We've got 820 million people who don't get enough calories, who are living in food shortage and all the problems that brings. They designed a dietary blueprint that would feed all of these people on a healthy planet. And what did they come up with? These experts, they came up with essentially the Blue Zones diet. They came up with a healthy plant-based diet. Your plate should be 50% fresh fruits and vegetables. You should have whole grains, legumes, plant sources of protein, and optionally animal sources of protein, and in modest amounts. So the animal stuff was optional. And how modest? Well, their findings on red meat, 7 grams a day of red meat is probably safe. 7 grams a day is probably safe. So should we be eating 7 grams a day if it's probably safe? I would say no.
No. What is 7 grams anyway? I mean, I'm trying to visualize 7 grams.
I had this conversation with a friend of mine recently who's a meat eater, and he reckoned it would probably be 1 small piece of steak every month or so.
Oh, wow.
And that's it. No more meat after that. None.
Wow. Okay, so you get once a month to go to the local steakhouse to have your little marshmallow of steak. That's funny. So Dr. Desmond, just to leave on a high note, maybe you could share some inspirational stories on patients that have come in at the end of the line and really crying for help and in absolute pain, and what you've done and where they are right now.
Well, I'll give you one example that is just fresh in my mind, something that happened at the clinic really recently, okay? So a man in his 70s, ex-military, overweight, okay? Really nice chap. He'd had a tough life, military service, etc., okay? And he came to me having just been diagnosed with Crohn's disease affecting his large bowel. Now, gladly, it wasn't very severe. It was towards the milder end of the spectrum. But the impact it was having on his quality of life was severe, okay? This is a kind of a stoic guy, not used to talking about bowel issues. He was pretty embarrassed to have to sit down with me and talk about his diarrhea and having to rush to the toilet and seeing blood in his stool. He was way out of his comfort zone, okay? So he'd been started on some treatment, and like most patients, he was feeling a little bit better on the treatment, but still very symptomatic and worried. So we did all the usual stuff that I do, as every qualified gastroenterologist does. And then we put some time aside to talk about food, okay? And I started with my kind of questions: how much fruit do you eat? How many vegetables do you eat? How many whole grains do you eat? Then we moved on to meat and dairy and processed food. And he was one of these like huge meat eaters. You might think that's kind of stereotypical ex-military guy. He had a barbecue that he uses all year round, okay? Not something that he just pulls out every now and then. He's just a barbecue guy. So he's, red meat guy, lots of chicken, all that kind of thing. So we had the conversation, and I showed him the dietary guidelines, and I showed him some evidence, and, he seemed quite interested in it, okay? So he comes back to see me 3 months later, and he has kind of really embraced it wholeheartedly. We talked earlier about doctors feeling pessimistic or nihilistic about patients taking advice, but you don't know how motivated your patient is. This guy took it right on board. He comes back to see me 3 months later. He's made a lot of healthy changes and he's feeling the benefit, okay? He comes back 3 months later after that. This is 6 months from his diagnosis. He doesn't even want to talk about his bowel habit anymore because he doesn't need to, because it's normal. It's back to normal. He's come off the medication that I had prescribed, which I wouldn't immediately advocate, to be honest. I wish he'd talked to me about that beforehand, but he's been off the medication for months. He's back to normal, okay? He's thrown away his barbecue. Literally, he's got rid of the barbecue, and we sat there and we talked about the progress he'd made. He had diabetes with a hemoglobin A1C of 50. It's now 40. So, not to sound dramatic, Luke, but as a side effect of part of his treatment for inflammatory bowel disease, he had reversed type 2 diabetes and he had lost 19 kilos in body weight. And he was a different man. He was full of energy. he told me that he'd been reconnecting, because I'd asked him to look at some of the videos I had on YouTube, and he'd reconnected. He'd gotten into going online, joined Facebook, whatever. He'd reconnected with a lot of his ex-military buddies. And at the most recent time I saw him just a week or two ago, we just sat there and all we talked about was how messed up the food system is in this country, how much better he was feeling on his new approach to eating. And he was just saying with regret, he's connecting with all his old buddies and they're struggling with cancers and heart disease and obesity and type 2 diabetes. And we spent, 15, 20 minutes just talking about all that stuff. And then at the end, I gave him another opportunity to talk about his bowel habit, because I'm a gastroenterologist. And he said, no, we don't need to talk about that. I'll see you in 6 months.
Wow, I love it. That's a brilliant story. And at 70 for him to make that shift. And I think that's inspiration for many
72.
72. And never underestimate the power of healing and the power of your patients. Because I think sometimes doctors, like you said, just say, well, they're not going to change, but who knows in that sense.
You're right.
So,
you need to plant that seed. You need to give them the information and let them know it's evidence-based. You're a healthcare professional. You're not going to recommend something that you haven't read about. And I hope you're not. I hope no medical professionals are just prescribing or recommending non-evidence-based interventions. But you're a medical professional. You've gone out. You've done the work. You've studied the papers. Here's my advice to you. That's powerful. That's really powerful.
Surely is. So the big question is, being in a CrossFit gym, have you inspired your CrossFit buddies to eat more beans and greens?
I think I have. Because I went to CrossFit, Luke, like 12 years ago before I ate a healthy plant-based diet, and I was 10 years younger, but I wasn't, what struck me in the last 6 months where I've gotten back to it, I had this big diversion there with marriage and young children, and I would stay fit, and I did a little bit of triathlon, and I would do a bit of running, and I did a bit of P90X and X3 and that kind of stuff. So I was always around fitness and rowing at the weekend and stuff. But to go back to CrossFit this year, I found that my recovery is so much better than it was 10 years ago. And I was there this morning, and then I was right back home with the kids, getting them all out to school and everything. And honestly, I feel like I could go back there right now and put in another hour. But have I? I think I have. Because both of the guys who run that place have just been quizzing me on it. And Josh, who's one of the coaches, has just quit dairy.
Oh,
having had a conversation
awesome.
with me. He's quit dairy. So progress is being made.
That's awesome. One day I do definitely want for us to have a training session together and even bring Cyrus Kambata. I'm not sure whether you know Cyrus from Mastering Diabetes.
Yeah,
He's a fellow CrossFitter, because we are always kind of bantering on WODs and things. So all three of us forming a team and just smashing it out on the wall balls. I reckon. So just to wrap up, and this is a question that I ask every person that I speak to, what does being awake mean to you?
I think being awake. So what does awake mean to me? What I've discovered, and like I said, I didn't come to this plant-based thing from any ethical or environmental concerns, right? I came to it because I was trying to give my patients evidence-based answers. Being awake to me means sitting down 3 times a day and fueling my body with food that I know is going to benefit me in the long term, is cruelty-free, is reducing my impact on the world in terms of my carbon footprint by 50 to 60 to 70%. It's that simple. It's the food you put on your plate 3-4 times a day. I can sit down every meal and just feel good about it. And there's a great sense of, it's about when your thoughts and your actions and your practices are all fully aligned, then you really feel awake. You literally wake up each morning and go, yeah, I'm okay. I'm doing all right here.
And I think you wake up with a lot more purpose in everything that you do. I think that's also key. For people that want to find out more about what you do, who you are, how can they follow you? Probably
the easiest way is just to find me on Instagram. So it's @DevonGutDoctor. That's Devon, Devon. I live in Devon, county in the southwest of England, and I'm a gut doctor, so it's at Devon Gut Doctor. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. I also am involved in running 2 whole food plant-based kind of online immersion programs with my friends Stephen and David Flynn at the Happy Pear. So if you do a Google search for Happy Gut Course or go to happygutcourse.com, you'll find us.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you very much once again, Dr. Desmond. Always a pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, Luke, I'd be glad to come back anytime, and I'm looking forward to that one.
Indeed. Take care. I hope you got lots of insight from our conversation today. I know I did. Hopefully, Dr. Desmond would have inspired you to look at a plant-based diet as a long-term solution for a happy and healthy gut. That's it for today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in and listening. If you think anyone can benefit from this information or the work that Dr. Desmond does, do share it with them. For more information, any links or resources mentioned in this episode, or to find out how to connect with Dr. Desmond, visit awakemethod.com/podcast. Until next time, live once, eat plants.